Microbiology, the scientific study of life. Control of breathing in humans. Humans can, the main breathing control centers are located in two regions of the brain, the medulla oblongata and the pons, as shown in this figure. Notice that. Aided by the control center in the pons, the medulla center sets the basic breathing rhythm. Secondary control over breathing is exerted by sensors in the aorta. Notice that. Secondary or sensor in the aorta and carotid arteries that monitor O2 and CO2 concentrations in the blood, as well as blood pH during deep breathing. Negative feedback mechanism prevents the lungs from overexpanding. Static sensors in the lung tissue send nerve impulses that inhibit the medulla's control center. The medulla's control center regulates breathing activity in response to changes in pH of the tissue fluid, cerebrospinal fluid bathing the brain. The pH of the cerebrospinal fluid is determined mainly by the CO2 concentration in the blood. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the cerebrospinal fluid, where it reacts with water and forms carbonic acid, which lowers the pH. When the medulla's control center registers a slight drop in pH, increase in CO2 level of the cerebrospinal fluid, it increases the depth and rate of breathing, and the excess CO2 is eliminated in the exhaled air. This occurs during exercise. For example, oxygen concentrations in the blood usually have little effect on the breathing control centers. However, when the O2 level is severely depressed at high altitudes, for instance, O2 sensors in the aorta and carotid arteries and the neck send alarm signals to the breathing control centers, which respond by increasing the breathing rate. Normally, a rise in CO2 concentration is a good indication of a full of O2 concentration, because CO2 is produced by the same process that consumes O2, cellular respiration. However, it is possible to trick the breathing center by hyperventilating. Excessively deep rapid breathing purges the blood of so much CO2 that the breathing center temporarily stops sending impulses to the rib muscles, and diaphragm breathing stops until CO2 level increase or O2 levels decrease enough. Switch the breathing center back on. The breathing center responds to a variety of nervous and chemical signals and adjusts breathing rate and depth to meet changing. It depends, however. Breathing control is effective only if it is coordinated with control of the cardiovascular system, so that there is a good match between lung ventilation and the amount of blood flowing through alveolar capillaries during exercise. For instance, increased cardiac output is matched to the increased breathing rate, which enhances O2 uptake and CO2 removal as blood flows through the lungs. Respiratory pigments bind and transport gases. The high metabolic demands of many organisms require that the blood transport large quantities of O2 and CO2. It appears that similar solutions that address the transport requirements set by high metabolic demands have evolved independently, and CO2 gradients play, using the mammalian respiratory system as an example. We will examine blood molecules called respiratory pigments that aid in the process of gas exchange. The role of partial pressure gradients. Gases diffuse down pressure gradients in the lungs and other organs. Diffusion of a gas, whether present in air or dissolved in water, depends on differences in a quantity called partial pressure. At sea level, the atmosphere exerts a total pressure of 760 millimeter Hg is a downward force equal so to that exerted by a column of mercury 760 millimeter high. Since the atmosphere is 21% O2 by volume, the partial pressure of O2 abbreviated PO2 is 0.21 by 760 or about 160 millimeter Hg is the portion partial pressure is the portion of atmospheric pressure contributed by O2, hence the term partial pressure. The partial pressure of CO2 PCO2 at sea level is only 0.23 millimeter Hg. When water is exposed to air, the amount of a gas that dissolves in the water is proportional to its partial pressure in the air and its solubility in water, and equilibrium is eventually reached when gas molecules enter the and leave the solution at the same rate. At this point, the gas is said to have the same partial pressure in solution as it does in the air. Thus, in a glass of water exposed to air at sea level air pressure, the PO is 160 millimeter Hg and the PCO2 is 0.23 millimeter Hg. A gas always diffuses from a region of higher partial pressure to a region of lower partial pressure. When blood arriving at the lungs via the pulmonary arteries has a lower PO2 and a higher PCO2 than the air in the alveoli. Notice that the air in the alveoli has a lower PO2 and a higher PCO2 than air at sea level, since it isn't completely replaced with fresh air during breathing. As blood enters the alveolar capillaries, CO2 diffuses from the blood to the air in the alveoli. Meanwhile, O2 in the air dissolves in the fluid that cools the epithelium and diffuses into the blood too. By the time the blood leaves the lungs in the pulmonary veins, its PO2 has been raised and its PCO2 has been lowered after returning to the heart. This blood is pumped through the systemic circuit 3. Notice that. In the tissue capillaries, gradients of partial pressure favor the diffusion of O2 out of the blood and CO2 into the blood. This is because cellular respiration removes O2 from and adds CO2 to the interstitial fluid again by diffusion from mitochondria and nearby cells. 4. Notice that after the blood unloads O2 and loads CO2, it is turned to the heart and pumped to the lungs again, where it exchanges gases with air in the alveoli. Respiratory pigments. The low solubility of O2 in water and those in the blood is a problem for animals that rely on the circulatory system to deliver O2. Suppose all our O2 were delivered in solution in the blood. During intense exercise, a person can consume almost 2 liters of oxygen O2 per minute, and all of it must be carried in the blood from the lungs to the active tissues, but at normal body temperature and air pressure. Only 4.5 milliliter of oxygen O2 can dissolve into a liter of blood in the lungs. If 80% of the dissolved O2 were delivered to the tissues, an unrealistically high percentage, the heart would need to pump 555 liters of blood per minute. In fact, most animals transport most of their O2 bound to certain proteins called respiratory pigments instead of an undissolved or in dissolved form. Respiratory pigments circulate with the blood, often contained with specialized cells. The pigments greatly increase the amount of oxygen that can be carried in the blood to about 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter in mammalian blood. In our example of an exercising human with a delivery rate of 90%, that 80%, that greatly reduces the cardiac output necessary for O2 transport to a manageable 12.5 liters of blood per minute. Oxygen transport. A diversity of respiratory pigments have evolved in various animal taxa. One example, hemocyanin, found in arthropods and many mollusks. Mollusks has copper as its oxygen binding components, coloring the blood bluish. The respiratory pigments of almost all vertebrates and a wide variety of invertebrates in the protein hemoglobin contained in the erythrocytes of vertebrates. Hemoglobin consists of 4 subunits, each with a cofactor called a hemagroup or a hemigroup that has an ion atom. At its center, the iron binds the O2. Thus, each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of O2. Like all respiratory pigments, hemoglobin must bind oxygen reversibly, eluding O2 in the lungs or gels and unloading it in other parts of the body, as shown in this video. This process depends on cooperativity between the subunits of the hemoglobin molecule. Binding of O2 to one subunit induces the other to change shape slightly, with the result that their affinity for O2 increases, and when one subunit unloads its O2, the other 3 quickly unloads too, as a shape change lowers their affinity for O2. Range of O2 partial pressure, PO2, where the dissociation curve has a steep slope. Even a slight change in PO2 causes hemoglobin to load or unload a substantial amount of O2. Notice that the steep part of the curve corresponds to the range of O2 partial pressure found in body tissues when cells in a particular location begin working harder during exercise. For instance, PO2 dips in their vicinity, and as the O2 is consumed in cellular respiration because of the effect of subunit cooperativity, a slight drop in PO2 is enough to cause a relatively large increase in the amount of O2 the blood unloads. As with all proteins, hemoglobin's conformation is sensitive to a variety of factors. For example, a drop in pH lowers the affinity of hemoglobin for O2, an effect called pore shift. Because CO2 reacts with water forming carbonic acid, H2CO3, an active tissue lowers the pH of its surroundings and induces hemoglobin to release more O2, which can then be used for cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide transport, in addition to its role in oxygen transport, hemoglobin also helps to transport CO2 and assists in buffering, that is, preventing harmful change in blood pH. Only about 7% of all of the CO2 released by respiring cells is transported in solution in blood plasma. Another 23% binds to the multiple amino groups of hemoglobin, and about 70% is transported in the blood in the form of bicarbonate ions. HCO3 minus carbon dioxide from respiring cells diffuses into the blood plasma and then into the erythrocytes. The CO2 first reacts with water assisted by the enzymes carbonic anhydrase and forms H2CO3, which then dissociates into a hydrogen ion H positive and HCO3 minus. Most of the H positive attaches to hemoglobin and other proteins, minimizing the change in blood pH. The HCO3 minus diffuses into the plasma as blood flows through the lungs. The process is rapidly reversed as diffusion of CO2 out of the blood shifts the chemical equilibrium in favor of the conversion of HCO3 to to CO2. Notice one. Carbon dioxide produced by body tissues diffuses into the interstitial fluid and the plasma too. Over 90% of the CO2 diffuses into red blood cells, leaving only 7% in the plasma as dissolved CO2. Step 3, some CO2 is picked up and transported by hemoglobin. 4. However, most CO2 reacts with water in red blood cells, forming carbonic acids H2CO3, a reaction catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase contained within red blood cells. 5. Carbonic acid dissociates into a bicarbonate ion HCO3 minus and a hydrogen ion H positive. 6. Hemoglobin binds most of the H positive from H2CO3, preventing the H from positive from acidifying the blood and thus preventing a pore shift. 7. Most of the HCO3 minus diffuses into the plasma where it's carried the bloodstream to the lungs. 8. In the lungs, HCO3 diffuses from the plasma into red blood cells, combining with H positive released from hemoglobin and forming H2CO3. 9. Also, carbonic acid is converted back into CO2 and water. 10. Notice that CO2 diffuses into the alveolar space from which it is expelled during exhalation. The reduction of CO2 concentration in the plasma drives the breakdown of H2CO3 into CO2 and water in the red blood cells. Step 9, a reversal of reaction that occurs in the tissues.